Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, my guest is music historian Bruce Comfort, and he's the world-leading expert about Robert Johnson, who's a legendary musician whose life and death is all surrounded by mist and mystery and a lot of legends. And we'll try to dispel all the myths and fake news about the life of Robert Johnson today with Bruce. Thanks for your time, Bruce. Thanks for joining me today.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I mean, we've spoken for so many years, and finally we get a chance to actually have a face-to-face conversation.
Yeah, it's wonderful because, as you said, you helped me writing a few articles for my music blog about dispelling myths about Robert Johnson. So today we do this in a video interview. So before we start, would you like to tell me and my viewers, well, I know already the whole story, but would you like to tell my viewers something about yourself, who you are and what got you so interested in Robert Johnson? Because you're not just one of the many, you're the world leading expert.
Well, thank you for saying that. Uh, I you know I grew up um, during the folk music revival in Greenwich Village in the late 50s and early 60s, and knew people like Dave Van Ronk, and took guitar lessons from Reverend Gary Davis. And I knew Son House and Mississippi John Hurt. So from a very early age, I was immersed in the culture and the music of the blues. And as I got older, and got more education, I just really found it my passion to delve as deeply as I could into all aspects of the blues. And Johnson particularly fascinated me precisely because people said nobody knew anything about him and nobody ever would know anything about him. And, that was enough for me to say to myself, that can't be right. I'm going to find out those mysteries. I'm going to find out the truth about Robert Johnson. And so I literally spent 50 years of my life producing the book, Jump the Devil, The Real Life of Robert Johnson.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're also the author of a very good book that I recommend everyone to read because it's the most complete story about the life of Robert Johnson. And great, thank you for showing it. That's the book, and I recommend everyone to
And
read it.
and it's really interesting. Just a little bit of self-promotion.
Feel free.
It's been published in Brazil.
Wow. So that's Portuguese.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
It's been published in France, and it's now being published in China. And which amazes me. I just saw the proofs for the cover of the Chinese edition, and there's a Japanese edition that's also going to be on the way.
No Italy yet.
No, well, that's for you to do. You convince those Italian publishers that they should publish an Italian version of the book.
I'd love to. I'd love to. Absolutely. So, Bruce, let me ask you something just to break the ice and let me and help me understand something. Is Robert Johnson, as we said, he's a legendary musician, but is he the founder of everything that we listen to today? Because we know that even rock and roll and heavy metal are born from blues. So, is he the father of it all, or just one of the many of that period?
He's one of the many, and he was promoted as being the first king of the Delta blues singers. Now, you have to remember that in 1961, when the first Columbia album, um, The Thesaurus of Jazz, came out, that was called Robert Johnson, King of the Delta Blues Singers. Prior to that, no other record company had really released any re-recordings of any of the early blues singers. And so that album was really the first introduction to the blues and to the Delta blues that anybody had ever heard, other than those few people who collected 78 records. So it was where Keith Richards and Eric Clapton, as the story is told, and all of those people. And here in the States, all of the young musicians like myself, uh, you know, he was the first person that we heard. He was the first Delta blues musician that we heard. And since somebody as authoritative as John Hammond, the producer, not his son, the musician, but John Hammond, the producer, since he was the one who produced that album, and since he said, well, Robert Johnson was the greatest of all time, and since we had nothing to compare it with, who were we to say, well, no, he's not? And so Robert kind of had a head start on all the other musicians. So that's the first thing. Robert was really the first person that all of those people who would become famous rock and roll musicians, he was the first person that they actually heard. And then he did write some of the songs that became absolute monumental standards, like Crossroad Blues, um, Kind Hearted Woman Blues, Sweet Home Chicago. I mean, there isn't a blues band in the world that doesn't play Sweet Home Chicago. I mean, these are standards that, when you're playing the blues, you have to play them. And so, those two things, the fact that Robert was the first person, the first musician to actually get exposure, and that he actually wrote some really great songs, you put those two things together. And yes, he obviously was incredibly influential, but he wasn't the only one. Big Bill Broonzy, extremely influential. Like I said, John Hurt, Son House, Muddy Waters. I mean, rock and roll would not be what it is without any of those people. So, you know, Robert Robert had some unique circumstances that allowed him to be so influential, but he's not the only one.
Okay, okay, very precise and complete. So let's assess the social situation. How was Mississippi in the early 1900s? What social context did Robert Johnson live in?
Well, first of all, it's a misnomer to think of Robert Johnson as being a Delta blues musician and being from the Delta because he was raised in Memphis. He was raised in Memphis, Tennessee. He was raised as a city kid. Yes, he was born in Martinsville, Mississippi, which is at the very southern end of the Delta. But by the time he was 1 year old, his mother took him to live with her ex-husband, who was living in Memphis because she could no longer take care of him. And so until he was about 10 or 11 years old, Robert grew up in Memphis. And it was the city that had the biggest the idea of the city, the idea of living in an urban environment that had the biggest impact on Robert. And when his mother, Julia, came and got him and took him back from her ex-husband and tried to bring him down to the Delta to live on a plantation, he kept running away. He hated plantation life. He didn't want to be a sharecropper. He wanted to live in the city. And so throughout his life, even from the time he was like 12, 13, 14 years old, he kept running away to go back to Memphis, to go back to Memphis, go back to Memphis. And then when he was an adult, when he was 18, 19 years old, he started, if when he was in Mississippi, he was living in places like Hattiesburg and in Jackson and in Clarksdale. So he was still living in cities. He was never really the kind of like urban sharecropping blues musician that we tend to associate with someone like Mississippi John Hurt or Son House, because those guys, they lived and they worked on plantations, most of their lives. Robert didn't.
Okay, that's interesting because indeed I had that wrong idea as well. So let's get to the heart of it, to the hottest topic of them all. So can we dispel once and for all that Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil at a crossroad? What really happened at that crossroad?
Yes, yes, and he actually never said that. That was you know, and Son House never actually said that. Um, that was a quote that somebody made up about an interview with Son House in 1964. Um, but it Son never said it, and Robert certainly never said it, and it really didn't start to gain popularity until after Robert's death. Um, well after Robert's death, and that's when the whole mystery of Robert's life started to emerge, and there's that famous story that Son did tell about how Robert disappeared from the Delta, um, and he couldn't play, at least according to Son House, he couldn't play, and when he came back about 8 months later, all of a sudden he could play amazingly well, and so people started to say, well, how did he get so good so fast? But there was a psychological crossroads in Robert's life, and we can talk about that. But there was no physical crossroads that he went to. He never tried to sell his soul to the devil, never said he tried to sell his soul to the devil. And even people like Honey Boy Edwards, you know, they started to make those stories up, you know, decades later, because that's what people were interested in.
Because that sells. Because people are intrigued by drama and by mystery.
Absolutely, absolutely. It fit in with the whole myth of Robert Johnson. I mean, how did he get so good so fast? Well, the truth is that he had been good. He was a good guitar player before he even met Son House. Robert didn't meet Son House until 1930, but Robert was already playing professionally by 1928.
Yeah.
He was playing for picnics and for parties and for jukes. And so the reason why Son House didn't think Robert could really play is because Robert's early repertoire was very different than Son. Son played bottleneck guitar and he played blues, mostly with an accompanist like Willie Brown. And Robert at that time was playing folk songs. He was playing old time folk songs, and they were passe. And people wanted to hear the blues, and they didn't want to hear the folk songs. So that's why that as far as I'm concerned, that's why Son said that Robert didn't know how to play, but Robert was actually a very accomplished guitarist before he even met Son House.
But we do have in the same period blues musicians who claim that they had sold their souls to the devil. I'm thinking here of Tommy Johnson, who's not related to Robert Johnson, and Clara Smith.
Tommy never said it.
Okay, so my source was wrong.
His brother Liddell said that story about him years after Tommy Johnson's death. Now, was there a common mythology about selling one's soul
Yeah.
to the devil at the crossroads? Yes, there was. It was a syncretic religious idea that came originally from the Yoruba group in Africa. Made its way through Brazil and Haiti, mixed with American Christianity. The African god Elegua, as it was translated here in the United States, became Legba, uh, another word for the devil. And yes, the crossroads in global mythology, not just African, but global mythology, the crossroads have always been seen as a powerful spot, as a spot where heaven meets the underworld, where the gods arise. It's just been seen as a power spot. And so that idea as folklore did exist. And so it was very easy to just superimpose that onto Robert. How did Robert get so good so fast? Well, because he sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads. But it never happened. What did happen, and this was probably going to be one of your next questions, is when Robert went away, he went to southern Mississippi in search of his father, in search of his biological father, and met a guitarist by the name of Isaiah Ike Zimmerman, who was a guitarist from Alabama, who had come to southern Mississippi to work building the highways. That was a pretty good job then. That was one of the best jobs that you could get as a black man in Mississippi in the South. And Ike was a great, great guitarist. He was really a terrific guitarist. It's a shame he never recorded. But according to his daughter, he just never wanted that kind of fame. But Ike took a liking to Robert. They met one night in southern Mississippi in a small town, and Ike tutored Robert for about 8 months. Robert actually lived with the Zimmerman family, and Ike tutored Robert. And one of the things that helped feed into the whole devil mythology is that Ike had a habit of playing the blues in a graveyard at night. Ike always said that if you want to learn how to play the blues, you have to play it at night in a graveyard. And so that's literally where he and Robert would go. They would go to the graveyard in Beauregard, Mississippi, and they would sit on two facing graves, and they would play guitar. So that just, again, that's another thing that just feeds into the whole mythology.
I would like to specify that you mentioned Ike Zimmerman's daughter, not because you read it somewhere, but because you met her. So it's a research of your own.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. I met her a couple times and did extensive interviews with her. Yeah,
Yeah, so this is an original research of your own. So that's why I'm saying you're the world leading expert because you're doing you did some research of your own. So okay, Robert Johnson didn't sell his soul to the devil. So what's the song "Preaching Blues" Up Jump the Devil about?
well, that's not the real name of the song. I mean, the name of the song is Preaching
Preaching
Blues,
Blues.
and it has absolutely nothing to do with the devil. The devil is never even mentioned in it. For whatever reason, and this we can never really be sure of why they did it, but for whatever reason, the record company subtitled Preaching Blues Up Jump the Devil. Maybe they thought that that would make it a more commercial song, but it has absolutely that song has nothing to do with the devil at all. Just like Crossroad Blues has nothing to do with the crossroad. The devil is never mentioned in Crossroad Blues. Um, the devil is never mentioned in Hellhound on My Trail. The only time the devil is mentioned is in songs like Me and the Devil. I mean, Me and the Devil was walking side by side. I said, "Hello, Satan. I believe it's time to go." But Robert sang a lot about voodoo practices, but he really didn't sing about the devil.
Okay, so that's a love song, isn't it? Preaching Blues. It talks about a woman.
Well, he talked about a woman in almost every song that he ever wrote.
Okay.
you know, I mean, songs were Robert's way to seduce women. I mean, he quite there's I mean, he was probably not much different than most young musicians. You use your music to seduce the women that you want to spend the night with. And so, yeah, I mean, most of his songs are about women.
Well, most of the songs in general, also rock songs or heavy metal songs are about, or rap songs are about love somehow. I
Well,
mean,
for sure, yeah.
yeah, that's most discussed topic in today's music also. So let's get to another point, which is quite tricky. How many pictures of Robert Johnson exist? Because we have two very famous, one in the photo booth and the other one in the studio. In both pictures, he's holding his guitar, and those are very famous. I mean, if I Google Robert Johnson, those two images are going to show up pretty easily. How many other photos of him exist?
There's only one other authentic photograph, and that's the one that's on the cover of Annie Anderson's book, Brother Robert, because it's another photograph from the dime store photo booth that Robert took the photo of himself holding, his KG-14 with the cigarette in his mouth. You can tell, he's holding the same guitar in the Annie Anderson photo, and he's got the same background. I mean, it's from the same session. So there are those two dime store photo booth photographs, and then there's the photograph you mentioned, the Hooks Brothers photograph, that was taken on Beale Street in Memphis just before he went to make his first recordings. So there's only three. Those are the only three that have thus far been verified. There is a fourth
Yeah.
that I saw that was owned by Mac McCormick, and it's of him, his sister Carrie, his stepsister Carrie, and her son Louis wearing his sailor suit because he was in the Navy. And Robert's wearing the suit that he's wearing in the Hooks brother photograph because that was actually Lewis's suit. Robert borrowed it. Mac McCormick had that photograph, and that's the one that Pete Guralnick mentioned in his book.
Yeah. Searching Robert Johnson.
But I have no idea what has ever happened to that photograph.
Okay.
Absolutely, I have no idea what happened to that photograph. So there is a fourth, but we don't know where it is. So there's only those three that we know of that have been seen in public.
So all the rest, including one where he's drinking a Coke or something like that, all of those are fake. I mean, there are other people.
Well, yeah, the one where he's with the soda bottles. I worked with people from the Smithsonian Institution and from major museums in the United States, and they all said that photograph had to be taken at least in the late 40s, if not the early 50s, because of the furniture, because of the size of the Coke bottle, and all these other
Yeah.
things. And so, I mean, yeah, that's no, the only three that we know for sure of are those, like I said, those two dime store photographs and the Hooks brother photo.
So there's a very famous conspiracy theory here, according to which some of his recordings were sped up because they're too fast for his times. And that also involves like his hands being too big and that look like claws. What can you tell us about those?
That's absurd, and it's completely false. It was made up by a couple of British music buffs who thought that Robert, they just didn't like that his voice was so high. They thought that
Hmm.
all bluesmen should sound a certain way. They should all sound like Muddy Waters, or they should all sound like Sun. And Robert Johnson, he has a very high voice. And so they slowed it down until they got his voice to sound the way they thought it should sound. And they said, "Oh, this is proof that Robert's recordings are at the wrong speed." But now I've caught it. But here's the evidence. Number one, why would the engineers, the people recording Robert, why would they speed him up? There were many other people who were being recorded by them that day. Why would they choose to only change the speed on his recordings and nobody else? Also, his recordings from San Antonio sound exactly the same as his recordings from Dallas.
Okay.
So that would have meant that they would have had to change the speed in both places 8 months apart. So first of all, that it just doesn't make any sense why they would do that. Secondly, none of the people who knew Robert Johnson, Robert Lockwood, um, Willie Mae Powell, Honey Boy Edwards, Johnny Shines, Calvin Frazier, none of those people, none of the people who actually knew Robert Johnson, who played with him, who heard him live, none of them ever said that there was anything wrong with his recordings.
Yeah,
Now, don't you think
of course.
that if his recordings were at a different speed, one of them would have said, "Well, gee, that's not really the way Robert sounded"? but none of them ever did. But the most important piece of evidence is when the Sony release, the Centennial edition of the complete Robert Johnson recordings was made. The engineers at Sony used they were able to get many of the original masters, Robert Johnson, the original master recordings of Robert Johnson, to make that CD collection with. And they were actually able to hear on those master recordings the original audio hum, the frequency, which was perfectly at 78 RPM. There is absolutely no question that Robert Johnson's recordings are at the correct speed.
Okay, so let's get to the end of the story. How and when did he die? Because we have a lot of mysteries and legends here as well.
Robert died in Greenwood, Mississippi, on August 16th, 1938. It's 38, right?
August
Here I am, the world's
16th.
greatest expert, right? Um,
You said August 16th, same day as Elvis Presley.
yes, oddly enough, yeah, it is. It is the
Okay.
same day as Elvis Presley. I have the death certificate right here. Yeah, it was 1938. Um,
Okay.
and just wanted to make sure, but it was an accidental death. Robert had been fooling around with a woman named Beatrice Davis, who was the wife of a man, Ralph Davis, who worked part time in the juke joint general store called Three Forks, just outside of Greenwood, Mississippi, on the Star of the West plantation. Well, at that time in the 1930s, it was it was a fairly common practice to put mothballs in somebody's drink,
Hmm.
not to kill them, but to make them sick. So, for instance, if you were running a juke joint and there was like a drunk who was really obnoxious and bothering everybody, you might slip a couple of mothballs or a mothball into one of his drinks, and he'd get sick and start to throw up and would have to leave.
Yeah.
That's what Ralph Davis did to Robert. He didn't intend to kill him, not at all. He just wanted to teach him a lesson. He wanted to get him sick. What he didn't know, and what no one knew except for Robert, was that just before going back down to Greenwood, while he was in Memphis, he had been complaining to his stepsister Carrie that he had very bad stomach pains and very bad chest pains. And she made him go to the John Gaston Hospital in Memphis for an exam. And there he was told that he had very bad ulcers and he had irritated, very badly irritated varices in his esophagus.
Hmm.
And this was all from his drinking, and that he really had to stop drinking, that he couldn't drink anymore. Well, of course, and that he should take a medicine called Amphogel, um, which was it was an antacid that was available at that time. Well, Robert didn't like the Amphogel, and he didn't. It wasn't something that you could like just walk into any drugstore, particularly in Mississippi, and buy this stuff. And so Robert didn't stop drinking, and he wasn't taking his Amphogel. And when Davis gave him the drink, it caused Robert to become very, very sick, and he started to throw up. And for 3 days, he kept throwing up. The varices in his esophagus ruptured. He was throwing up blood, and he eventually bled to death. And he is buried for sure at the Little Zion Cemetery on Money Road in Greenwood, Mississippi, underneath a big pecan tree. And the reason we know that for sure is because we spoke to the woman whose husband actually dug his grave. Her name was Rosie Eskridge, and her husband's name was Tom Eskridge, and he was a deacon for the Little Zion Church, and he dug Robert's grave. And then, even more importantly, Robert was buried as a pauper because he was just an itinerant musician. And when his stepsister Carrie found out about his death, she went down to Greenwood and she hired the only black undertaker, Paul McDonald, and had him dig Robert back up, have him put in a real legitimate casket, have a real preacher there, and had him reburied in the same spot.
Okay.
And we found his records. So there is absolutely no doubt that is where Robert is buried. I know that there are two other places that claim to be, where he's buried, but let's face it, tourism is a big industry. It's probably the only industry that Mississippi has at this time. And so why wouldn't somebody want to claim that Robert Johnson was buried there? But he's only buried in one place. A person can only be buried in one place, and the place he's buried is Little Zion Church on Money Road in Greenwood.
Well, here conspiracy theorists say that his body actually disappeared and we don't have his body and that he was taken to hell by the devil himself.
Well, not even remotely true.
Of
I
course.
mean, this, you know, when 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 we started writing the book, my associate Geraldine Wardlow, who provided a real wealth of information, um, you know, we started to think of the fact that virtually everything we thought we knew about Robert Johnson was wrong, and pretty much everything that anybody had ever said about Robert Johnson was wrong. I mean, we found out an entirely different story about an entirely different man than the mythology had created.
Well, let me ask a final question. So, you already said something, but I would like you to elaborate. Blues music is often associated with evil and darkness because, apart from this story, we had a very famous musician called Howling Wolf who used to sing a song called Am I Evil or something like that. And we also get to George Thorogood singing I'm Bad to the Bone. And even Muddy Waters is an obscure name, okay? So why was that? Why was blues so associated with darkness?
I think it's a very simple reason. The men went and juked on Saturday, Friday, and Saturday, and they had no money left for church on Sunday. And it was only the women who went to church on Sundays because all the men were hungover and they had no money. And there it got to be this whole, aside from the folkloric element, as we spoke about, you know, there really was a whole antipathy towards the blues because it was music that took people away from God. Because it was, it was sexual. You know,
Yeah,
the
sure.
blues was a very sexy music. So that's something that takes you away from the holiness of God. Like I said, it uses up all your money. So that's something that, takes you away from God. It makes you do crazy things, wanton things. You get drunk and you carouse and you have sex and I mean, virtually everything about the blues, particularly in that environment. It's not like that anymore, at least not really. Because you've got, primarily upper class white guys doing it now. But back then, it was like the only thing that gave young black men any kind of power because they didn't have power in you asked about the social context earlier. I think it was one of your first
Yeah,
questions. I mean, a black man growing up in the South, whether it was Mississippi or Georgia or Alabama or wherever it was, they had no power. They were boys. I mean, that's why we have the famous, song, "I'm a man, I'm not a boy. I'm an man, not boy." That was a major thing for Muddy to sing in the 1950s. Because in the 1920s and the 1930s, what could you do if you were a young black man? You could be a sharecropper and work your tail off for virtually no money at all, or you could be a musician,
of course.
you know?
Well, I think that there was also a concept of, breaking the rules, because we saw the same phenomenon in the 70s and in the 80s with bands such as the Black Sabbath, of course, were obsessed with darkness somehow. And we also had skulls on the cover of many heavy metal records. So I think it's a sort of the same phenomenon.
Well, yeah, but by the time you're talking about, that became purely a commercial idea.
Of course.
I mean, it really didn't speak to the zeitgeist of the time. I mean, in the 1970s, people were not, well, maybe there were a few people, but people were not going around worshiping the devil,
Of
I
course,
mean,
no,
all,
no.
all of that stuff. And so, I mean, Black Sabbath and all, heavy metal and all of that stuff, that was a very calculated commercial thing. In the 20s and 30s, I mean, maybe there was some I mean, Robert wanted to be famous. I mean, he went to New York, to try to get on the amateur hour, the same amateur hour that discovered Frank Sinatra. Um, but he wasn't able to do it. I mean, Robert wanted to be famous, but it wasn't the same kind of calculation. He wanted to be famous because he didn't want to live in poverty, you know? I mean, Gene Simmons, I'm sorry, but Gene Simmons would would not have been living in poverty whether he had formed Kiss or not.
Sure.
You know, I mean, they're certainly not the same kind of poverty. I mean, life was hell for young black men in the 20s and 30s, particularly, if you were down in that part of the South. And I mean, and if you're going to talk about the Delta, because even though Robert lived largely in cities, I mean, he in the Delta was one of his main stomping grounds. I mean, the Delta had more lynchings than any other than the entire state of Mississippi, and Mississippi had more lynchings than any other state. I mean, Johnny Shines was he was very, very sad, obviously, when he heard that Robert had died, but he was sad for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that Robert wanted him to go with him down to Greenwood, but Johnny would not go into Mississippi because he said, it's always open season on niggers in Mississippi, and I'm not going down there. And so he felt really bad because he thought, well, maybe if I had gone with Robert, I could have stopped him from being killed like that. Um, but yeah, I mean, Johnny didn't even want to step into Mississippi. It was that bad. So I mean, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to be a sharecropper and just be a boy? Or are you supposed to try to find some kind of power in creating your own, we would say today, your own brand?
Yeah. Of course. Well, Bruce, many thanks for your time. I think that this very interesting discussion that we had can help a lot of people have a clear picture about Robert Johnson and dispel some myths, because, of course, he never sold his soul to the devil, and he never did, and he was never abducted to hell or anything of the sort. So, I think that what we did today is very important and interesting for the history of this very legendary musician.
Well, I hope that we were able to elucidate some of the things about Robert, because as you probably know, I've got a, a Facebook uh, site,
Yep.
dedicated solely to dispelling the myths about Robert, because people just keep telling them, like, it's like, our book is the definitive book. I mean, it's all true. All the facts are there. There are literally thousands of footnotes. We didn't make any of this stuff up, and yet people still tell the same old myths over and over and over again.
And wait for Halloween to come, and then we'll make even more. Yeah. It's 1 month from now. I'll add to the description of this video the link to your book and to your Facebook group about the real Robert Johnson.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody else for watching this video, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.